I'm a nurse at a rehab center. It's Hell on Earth Part 2. My entire world had been turned upside down in the span of mere minutes. The job I had worked so hard for almost my whole life turned out to be a living nightmare. I had been forced to torture a patient and had seen orderlies slam a patient to the ground and most likely break one of her bones. And it was still my first day. As I rolled Todd into his room, I was struck by how plain and depressing it looked. It looked more like a prison cell than a hospital room, as it should have looked. The only bit of individuality inside the room was a carving into the wall. Todd was here. I closed the door behind us. Once I had completely rolled Todd into the room, he sprang up from his chair and practically threw himself into his bed. "Home sweet home. Thanks, Nurse Cassandra," he said with a chuckle as he shimmied around in bed. I stared at him, a little dumbfounded over how he had so easily just left from the wheelchair after such a horrible procedure. He noticed my worry and waved his hand at me. "It's not too bad once you get used to it." "I am so sorry, Todd," I told him, gripping the handles of the wheelchair and trying to keep myself from crying in front of him. I looked back up from the chair and saw that he was sitting in bed and looking at me. "I know you didn't mean to do it, so don't sweat it, okay? This place is fucked up, and you're going to do and see some really bad shit. Just try not to forget who you are, and do your best to stick it to Nurse Whore," he said with a tired smile. I finally got a good look at Todd and noticed just how malnourished he was. "Are you eating properly?" I asked him, pushing his wheelchair to the side and quickly pulling my stethoscope out. This caught him off guard and he quickly started backing up in his bed, but I caught up to him before he could get too far away. I quickly began to listen to his heart and his lungs. "I try not to eat the food. They know I don't take my meds, so they try to sneak it into the food," he explained. Despite how he looked, his heart and lungs sounded just fine. I wish I could have done a more thorough check, but I did have limited means to test on him. "What kind of meds?" I asked, taking my stethoscope off and softly patting it into my palm. My nurse mode completely activated. "I wish I knew, but it turns you into one of those zombie patients. And I enjoy my personality, so I try not to take them if I can help it," Todd explained, which got me even more worried about just what type of hell I had sold my soul to. "I have to get back to Nurse Taylor," I told him as I looked over Todd again. "Don't get yourself killed, please." Those words came out of my mouth without me even thinking twice. Todd was the first person I had met at Sombra that felt like an actual person. He seemed just as caught off guard as I had been. "Hasn't happened yet, but I promise." He held up his pinky to me. I couldn't help but let out a little giggle and wrapped mine around his. I took his wheelchair with me and began to make my way back towards the lobby, only getting lost once, which I counted as a win for myself. "Ah, there you are, Nurse Cassandra. I was beginning to think something had happened to you." Nurse Taylor was waiting for me in the lobby with Nurse Emily and the receptionist lady I had met on my first day here. "Todd is safely in his room?" she asked as she motioned for Emily to take the chair from me. "Yes, ma'am. No issues to report." I sounded like a robot, but it was the only way I could stop myself from becoming too emotional over my current situation. My new tones seemed to make Nurse Taylor absolutely ecstatic. "Wonderful." She clapped her hands together giddily. "Now, if you'd follow me, you're going to help me administer medication to a few patients. This way you'll get an idea of how to do it." She turned on her heels and motioned for me to follow after her. I let out a sigh and followed after her, leaving Emily and the receptionist alone in the lobby. I followed after Nurse Taylor as she made her way down the dull gray hallway. Finally, we came up to a room and she opened it up for us to enter. I followed after her and was met with a patient who was smashing his head over and over again on one of the walls of his room. Now, Mr. Jordan," Nurse Taylor told the man carefully as she walked over to him and pulled him gently away from the wall. "We've talked about this. No hitting yourself, remember?" she asked him. As she pulled him away from the wall, I watched, sickened, as most of his forehead skin peeled away and fell to the floor. "Shouldn't we get him some medical attention?" I asked, wanting to help the man desperately. But Nurse Taylor simply laughed in my face as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a pill. She held it up to Mr. Jordan, but he didn't seem to react at all. "Come give me a hand, Cassandra." She motioned for me to come over. I took a small step forward, thinking of how I could get out of it, but eventually, I just gave up and walked over to her. "Good girl. Now take this pill." "I'll hold." Mr. Jordan's mouth open. I took the pill from her and looked down at it. It was a capsule of sorts with some kind of black liquid inside of it. I held it between my fingers and watched as Nurse Taylor stuck her fingers into Mr. Jordan's mouth and forced his jaw open violently. I thought for a second that she was going to rip his jaw off with the force she opened it. I quickly placed the pill in his mouth and stepped back as Nurse Taylor shut his mouth and tipped his head back so that he could swallow it. "There's a good boy," she smiled, patting Mr. Jordan on the head and carefully leading him to his bed. He seemed almost completely catatonic, and Taylor led her to bed without much issue. She tucked him into bed and turned to leave him, his forehead bleeding profusely from the gash he'd created. "Shouldn't we bandage him?" I asked Nurse Taylor as she turned to leave Mr. Jordan alone in bed. She stared at me like I'd just spoken some foreign language at her. "So that it won't become infected? Don't bother with something so pointless, dear." She patted me on the head like I was an idiot and walked out into the hall. Before I could even think of trying to help Mr. Jordan, Nurse Taylor grabbed me by the wrist and yanked me away from his room. She led me to another few patients' rooms. Each one was inhabited by a husk of a human, with one of them, a girl who looked barely above 18, tied down to the bed. I was told that this had happened to her because she kept trying to chew through her wrists. She was bound to her bed by her arms and legs, and even her neck was tied down to the bed. "This is inhumane," I mumbled as I continued to follow after Nurse Taylor. She stopped in her tracks and I actually bumped into her. I quickly backed up and watched as she spun on her heels to stare at me. "Oh, sweetie, these aren't people anymore. They're addicts." She was so condescending that it made me sick. Staring at her, for the first time in my life, I actually felt like punching someone in the face. They made the choices that led to them being treated here. They stopped being human when they decided to become addicts. I was disgusted by how she could say this about people who needed help. Before I could even raise my voice against her, I felt a lingering presence behind me. "What the hell are you doing?" a tired posh voice asked us. I turned my head to find that Constantine Sinclair was standing behind me, nursing a cup of coffee with his umbrella now open and shielding him from the fluorescent lights above his head. "Yes, sir. I was just showing our new nurse here how to correctly deal with our patients." Nurse Taylor's demeanor had shifted again. Now she seemed like a desperate housewife who had an abusive husband. "I was also educating her about our addicts and such," she said with a forced chuckle, grabbing my arm and pulling me over to her. Sinclair grunted, clearly not giving a shit about what she was saying. He took a long sip of his coffee as he stared down at me and Taylor. As I stared at him, I could have sworn that from inside his umbrella I could see two white eyes staring back at me from the void. "Whatever. Just make sure she knows her place." He walked past us without another word. Taylor let out a long sigh like she had been holding her breath the entire time that Sinclair had been standing there in front of us. "Goodness me, he's in such a good mood today," she said, her face turning red as she watched him walk away. I didn't think that was the case. He looked like he'd been in an absolute shit mood. "That's all for today, Cassandra. I want you to take everything I've taught you to heart." You'll be given more responsibilities tomorrow, understand? She asked after she had regained her composure. I wanted to say something back to her, but I figured it would be better to just keep quiet. I was left alone and decided to go back to my room. I had come back to the employees only section and had scanned my card to open the door when one of the nurses suddenly bumped into me and started running away down the hallway. Before I could process that, 4 other nurses quickly chased after her. What's happening? I asked one of the nurses inside as I closed the door behind me. She looked at me and looked like she was processing what I had just asked her. Oh, she cracked. Couldn't take it anymore. Shame, really. I liked her. She shrugged as she looked back down at her clipboard. What's going to happen to her? I asked. The clipboard nurse looked at me puzzled. And then, after staring at me for a second, she nodded. You're new. Well, she's probably going to Mr. Sinclair's office. Point of advice, sweetie. You don't want to be sent there. She tucked her clipboard under her arm and walked away, leaving me more terrified than I'd been before I walked in. I quickly ran past other nurses and ran to my room, quickly slamming the door behind me and feeling a panic attack coming on. As I slammed my back against my door and slid down to the floor, I noticed that another sticky note had been left on my mirror. I stood up and quickly ran over to the mirror and snatched up the note. To my surprise, it was a doodle of me and who I assumed was Todd together with a heart around us. I was so caught off guard that I let out a snort and giggled to myself as I felt a few tears fall from my cheek. I was sure that Todd was behind this, though I had no idea how he'd managed to sneak into the employees only section and then into my room. I took the little doodle and stuck it back on my mirror with the others. After I took a few minutes to compose myself, I decided to go visit Todd. He was the first person I had met at Sombra that felt like an actual person. He seemed just so easy to talk to. I walked out of the employees only section and out into the hallways. As I walked down them and toward Todd's room, I had to walk past several husks and I did my best to check on them and make sure that they were okay. Most of them were unresponsive to my questions and only seemed to react when I poked and prodded at them. A few of them had serious injuries, and I did my best to bandage them with the few band-aids and pieces of gauze I had in my pockets. After treating the last husk I walked over to Todd's room and opened the door. I was surprised to find him holding a chair over his head like he was about to smash me over the head with it. Oh shit, it's you, he said in surprise, quickly setting the chair back down and letting out an exasperated laugh. I thought you were gonna be an orderly or nurse whore. He sat down on the chair he was about to hit me with and let out a long, loud laugh. You could have killed me, I panted, clutching my heart from the sheer panic that had come over me. More importantly, how did you get into my room? I demanded to know, crossing my arms at him and doing my best to act tough. Huh? He asked, clearly confused. Are you crazy, lady? If you think I was able to sneak into the employees only section and I'd still choose to stay here, maybe you're the one who belongs here, not me. He scoffed, leaning back in the chair and pushing it back to balance on the 2 back legs. Then, I looked around his room and noticed that he also had a sticky note stuck to his wall. I walked over quickly to it and got a better look at it. Please, by all means, go through my stuff. He followed my movements with his eyes and watched as I took the sticky note off of his wall. So, you didn't draw this? I asked him, staring at the sticky note that had a doodle of Todd on it. He was smoking a cigarette and flipping me off. It was a good likeness of him. No, that was the doodler, Todd said, almost losing his balance and falling backward onto the floor. We've got no idea who it is or why they do it, but they leave those doodles all over the place. Todd shrugged as he sat up straight in the chair and stood up quickly. Want to have a smoke break? You aren't allowed to have cigarettes in rehab. I squinted at him as I stuck the doodle back onto the wall. Where'd you even get them? He walked past me and stuck his hand into his pillowcase. and he pulled out a pack of cigarettes, starting to smack the box against his hand. That receptionist gets them for me. In return, I help her carry all the heavy shit she needs to file. Todd chuckled as he walked past me and out into the hall. I shook my head as I followed after him. Though I really couldn't judge him, if this place was shaping up to be hell on earth, then he might as well enjoy his cancer sticks. I followed him as he led us to the garden, and thanked him as he held the door open for me. We both picked a bench in the corner of the garden, and I sat next to Todd as he sparked his BIC lighter to life and lit his cigarette. "So, what are you addicted to?" I asked him, trying and failing to make small talk with him. He stared at me and couldn't help but laugh in my face. I felt my face go red in embarrassment, and I quickly turned to avoid his gaze and cackles. "Don't worry about it. I just love how straightforward you were about it." He snickered as he took a deep drag of his smoke. "Pills mostly. Xanax, Oxy, barbiturates, you name it. Sleeping pills especially." He held his cigarette in his mouth as he leaned back on the bench and stared up at the sky. This was supposed to be a fresh start. A fat load of good it did me. He closed his eyes and let out a tired sigh, a puff of smoke escaping his lips. "I'm so sorry." I reached over and took his hand into mine. "I came here wanting to help people. This always been my life's passion. And now look where it's gotten me." I found myself squeezing his hand subconsciously. "I can't help anyone here. They won't let me help anyone." I noticed that I had been squeezing his hand and I quickly let it go. "I don't mean to sound like a dick, but do I have to call you Cassandra?" I looked up at him and saw that he was now staring at me with a smile. "It's way too stuffy and formal. I'd rather call you something easier," he said with a wink. He stared at me for a moment before looking up at my hair. "What about red? I like that much better." I smiled at him and let out a little giggle. "It isn't very original, but I like it," I said as I pushed a lock of my hair back into place behind my ear. Todd nodded and smiled back at me. Suddenly he spat out his cigarette and quickly stomped on it. He then grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the bench, pulling me into the bush behind it. What are you?" Before I could process everything, he quickly covered my mouth with his hand and shushed me. "Get away from me!" A girl screamed before suddenly falling in front of us where we had been sitting on the bench beforehand. I quickly shoved myself into Todd's chest as I watched the horror before me unfold. "The less you fight this, the quicker it'll end," a tired posh voice told the screaming woman. It was Constantine Sinclair. I watched from behind the bush as he placed his foot on the woman's head and held it there as she squirmed uncontrollably. "Well, get on with it. This bitch is going to ruin my shoes at this rate." It sounded like he was talking to someone, but I didn't see anyone else there. The woman was suddenly bitten in the face by a tar-covered creature that had emerged from seemingly nowhere. I couldn't help but let out a horrified and muffled scream. Lucky for me, Todd still had his hand over my mouth, stopping any noise from escaping. The creature ripped large chunks of flesh off of the woman, and before our eyes, it had devoured every ounce of the woman. There wasn't a single sign that she had even been there. "God damn it, you got blood on my suit. When will you learn to eat your food less sloppily?" Sinclair hissed in anger as he walked away. The tar figure seemed to disappear into his shadow as he walked away. I looked up at Todd and he slowly and carefully lowered his hand from my mouth. "That's what happens when you're a patient here." He let out a pained sigh. I stared back at where the woman had once been. Just what had I gotten myself into?